It's great to reconnect with you, Elias. I know we chatted a couple months back. I found some of your videos online where I think you'd done like a flyover of some forests in the Amazon, and or maybe it was a Google images you put together, but it was quite interesting. And you brought up going through your videos, you brought up a lot of interesting points about carbon credits that I thought would be cool to get you on and discuss. So I know you're starting a new company now, but I guess kind of for everyone, just give like a quick background of yourself and anything you want to share. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. My name's Elias. Yeah, I guess my background is initially in forest science with like a concentration in remote sensing. So I have a master's and PhD in the subject. Mostly, I was basically doing remote sensing to analyze, forest carbon concentrations using remote sensing technologies and using like more cutting edge, like deep learning stuff. So I used a lot of like LiDAR and satellite imagery to see whether or not we could measure forest carbon accurately, which you can. I finished my PhD in kind of my academic work in 2019. And after that, I went and worked for basically a small technology startup called Pachama. And what Pachama does is they basically review forest carbon projects using remote sensing, figure out which ones are good, purchase from the good ones, and then kind of resell those credits for a markup, of course. I was head scientist at Pachama for about 2.5 years. And during that time, I reviewed about 120 forest carbon projects in some way or another. So I had a really like high level overview of the space. I think a lot of people don't necessarily see. A lot of people are kind of like focused in on their little project types or their geographies. One of the key takeaways was that the industry is deeply flawed. Pachama has no qualms about saying that they reject something like between 50 and 75% of the projects that they come across, and on serious grounds of having like problems with their justification or not necessarily they shouldn't necessarily exist in the first place. So one of the things that always bugged me at Pachama was that we couldn't really like describe our findings, and that I've always thought that we need to be completely public about which projects are doing good and bad. So I left Pachama last year, did a little soul searching, and now I've co-founded a company called Renoster. And basically what we do is we review forest carbon projects. The idea is to be completely transparent about our methodology and our findings, and basically tell the world which projects are good and bad so that the market can kind of correct and people can buy from the projects. So that's where I
cool. Yeah. And so, no, I when I came across your videos, I thought it was super interesting what you're doing. And I guess like why, so are these all the projects you reviewed? Are they Vera? Are they gold standard? Is it kind of a mix of different registries? Is it a mix? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I've reviewed projects from every registry, and I mean about equally. There aren't too many gold standard projects. I do focus exclusively on nature-based projects, and when I say nature-based, I guess I mean like forestry, mangrove, peat bog. So there aren't too many gold standard, but I mean, Climate Action Reserve, Vera, American Carbon Registry, I've reviewed dozens of each of those, if not more. So.
Yeah, sure. And so I guess my question would be, why are, what's failing? Why are the projects accepted? Do maybe the registries just not know? Are the auditors not doing a good job? What's your view there?
Well, I think it starts with the protocols. Most of the protocols are really have a lot of holes in them that can be manipulated. And if you leave it to the market, then of course people are going to manipulate it. Maybe that's a little bit too cynical a take. If you were to follow the protocol of maybe the two biggest bodies out there, the American Carbon Registry and Vera, and follow the letter of the law to conserve a forest area and get credits for it, you would simply end up with too many credits. The methodologies that they propose to use to, say what would have happened to this forest if the project didn't exist, simply end up, delivering you too many credits. And so the situation we're in is that most people are just following these protocols, and getting issued too many credits, and only, a select few, like 25% or something, are really being extra conservative with their numbers. And it does depend on the protocol. So there are protocols out there that are much more conservative and much better. And then there are protocols out there that are very loosey-goosey. So that's the protocol side of things. You brought up auditors and verifiers. I think the system that's in place today is deeply flawed in that the verifiers and auditors are really not independent in any like real sense of the term. The way that it works is that a project developer develops a project, and then they go and hire a verifier to sign off on what they've done, to sign off on their numbers. There is not much of an incentive for a verifier to throw up roadblocks. They're getting paid by the project developer. I've known a lot of verifiers. They're great people. But if they do find a problem, then this, they get paid the same amount either way. This turns from a 2-week verification into like a month or 2-month long verification, and they just don't want that in their lives. Mm-hmm. So there's just not an independent system for being really objective about the findings of these projects.
And have you seen any sort of initiatives to, I don't know if it would come, from within Vera or, ACR, but have you seen any initiatives to kind of, I guess, separate this from the project paying the verifier, like, or directly having that interaction, like maybe something more fair, I guess?
Well, I think what's happened in the market is that there is now this secondary market that's valued at something like $500 million of these secondary companies that come in and then say whether or not the project is actually doing good or bad. And that's what my company does, of course, for Noster. That's what Pachama did in its own way. I mean, it was different, a business model, but essentially they were a third-party verifier on top of the verification system. And there's other players out there too, like Silvera and B0 and whatnot.
Sure. But I guess okay, so for like Corsia, right? Corsia credits, they accept, it's a pretty broad range, right? So these credits that you might say, hey, they're good, these are bad. The bad ones still slip through to, I guess the Corsia program is probably the biggest program out there. So how does that get, do you have any ideas on how that gets fixed? Or I guess maybe this is just super high up and, maybe, Corsia is making these decisions, right? Maybe it's someone there or something.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of methods that us as third-party kind of analysts use to see whether or not carbon projects are good and bad. And when I say us, I mean like Renoster and Silvera and all these other third layers. What we would need is for the body that is Corsia to recognize that you need to do this extra level of due diligence on these projects and in order to get it right. There's been hesitation for large, I guess I would say multinational groups to kind of push for that level of due diligence. Mostly they've kind of fallen back on kind of easier ways of trying to filter out the bad projects. So, 3 common techniques that I'll see are people either pushing for removals credits, the idea that if you are somehow sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere, that's more pure or better, which I think is pretty flawed. They push for more recent issuance issuance credits. So, if you have a project going from 2012 to 2040, they'll push for credits from more recent dates, which again, I don't think makes too much sense. And, they'll push for credits that are from certain parts of the world or something. I don't think any of these are really great ways of getting to which projects are doing good or bad, but these are kind of the low hanging fruit that I guess the bureaucrats have settled on.
Yeah. Especially the vintage is really interesting to me, right? Because one of the things you brought up in one of your videos is actually older vintages in a lot of cases in good projects should be worth more. I guess maybe a ton of sequestered carbon, 10 years ago is probably more impactful than it is maybe today. And so is it just because these programs are out there that only accept, 2016 plus that these credits are, valued less? Is that it?
Yeah. And there's just this stigma that we've gotten better or that newer credits are going to be, kind of more bulletproof than older credits. We haven't gotten better. The projects are still just as bad. The protocols haven't really changed. I mean, there's been a couple of little modifications. Ultimately, I would always opt for an older credit over a newer credit if I knew that the credit was good. And there's a couple of major reasons for that. The first being that carbon removed in the past is doing more for climate change than carbon removed today. Basically, the carbon cycle is kind of a positive feedback loop. The earlier you get the carbon out of the atmosphere, the better, the better that is for everybody. Another big reason is that from a societal point of view, there is less damage done to human society in terms of monetary damage or human lives from carbon that was removed a long time ago. Just from a quality perspective, if we accept the notion that there are good projects and bad projects from any date, and we have to do some extra layer of due diligence, and we do that extra layer and find that old credits are good, then it makes sense to invest in old credits because there's just less risk because, these projects have been going on for 10 years and they've been successful, presumably. And therefore, I would trust them a lot more than I would trust a brand new project from 2022 that has had like no time to actually, find its footing.
Sure. And I guess when I think about this from like if I'm a big corporate and I want to get the best credits and I, want to find those older credits that are for good projects, are those really even out there still, or have most of those been retired? I'm not even actually aware.
They are out there, and they sell for less because so many people are snapping up, high quality credits. I mean, I know of some very good undervalued projects that have credits from like pre-2016 that are floating around that they can't manage to offsell, even though these projects have been spectacularly successful and have understated their true value. Also, I mean, there's also kind of a stigma around old projects with new credits. But again, if you have an old project that has been successful to date and done everything right, it makes sense to buy those credits from that one.
And I guess, okay, so for your own company, Renoster, how do you guys differ from Silvera?
One of the key ways that we differ is that we're doing everything transparently. So I don't know what real methods Silvera uses to evaluate projects. They put out like a couple of documents that say like, oh, we use like remote sensing, or I don't really know what that means. We have a rubric that is very public that you can see exactly which tests we are running and exactly how you get to a score. Our scores, what we're basically trying to do is evaluate how good a carbon project is at actually removing CO2. So instead of giving some like abstract score from like an A to an AA plus or something, we're putting an actual number that says when you buy 1 ton of credits, we think you're getting 0.7 tons or 1.5 tons. And then, the other thing that we want to do is we really want to shift this whole business model to like a freemium model, because I mean, I'm adamant that this data be made public because most people aren't aware of the quality differences between projects. And we're not going to be able to correct for that. The market's not going to be able to correct for bad projects unless this data is out there. Mm-hmm. So we eventually make all of our reviews public. There's a little bit of a delay so that if you're one of our customers, you get early access. But the idea is to be completely transparent about our techniques and about our findings.
It just doesn't seem like the voluntary market to me would be enough. The big corporates just, it's basically the big corporates only buying right now as the end customer. It doesn't seem big enough to me. So like, how do you think we get there to, I guess mass use of, carbon credits and actually moving towards, decarbonization?
I guess you're right. I mean, a lot of companies have made pledges that are getting uncomfortably close to having to be fulfilled. So we'll see if they actually fulfill those pledges on the voluntary market. I guess call me a cynic, and I really am a cynic here. I don't see necessarily I don't see the U.S. federal government instituting a compliance market anytime soon. I just don't. I don't see a lot of these countries and stuff doing that. So I don't know if the compliance market can do it, but I think that's kind of what we're left with in a lot of cases. A lot of companies. I mean, if you look at the Fortune 500 list, at least half, I think, have made pretty solid commitments to reduce their emissions that probably will involve offsetting in some way. So we have to pressure them to make sure that they stick to those commitments. If they do stick to those commitments, then I would say, yeah, okay, maybe the voluntary market is in some ways successful in that regard.
Yeah, sure. And then do you have any views on kind of the cap and trade model? Like, do you think that's a good model, or I mean, it's quite different from, actually having forestry projects and stuff like that.
I do think it's a good model. Yeah, I mean, I think it largely works in California. I think one interesting side effect is that in the compliance markets, nobody really seems to care about quality quite as much. So people often criticize the voluntary market for its quality issues. The compliance market, there's just nobody even looking. Nobody cares at all. And yet I can tell you that a lot of CARB projects have just as many problems with their quality as the voluntary market. So I wonder if that's a potential problem for a compliance marketplace.
Is like, have you ever, I was reading something the other day, like mangroves actually, like per hectare, like they sequester like maybe 5 times more carbon than your average, Amazon rainforest or something. Like, have you looked at any, mangrove renewal projects in the past, or?
I have, and yeah, they do sequester quite a lot. You really have to be careful about a lot of these kind of comparisons, because it really depends on. It always depends on the specific scenario or ecosystem, right? So what is the Amazon rainforest sequestering? Maybe nothing. I mean, arguably zero, right? Because the Amazon rainforest is in kind of a steady state system, and scientists quibble endlessly about whether or not it's like slowly bleeding out CO2 or whether or not it's actually sequestering CO2. It's a fierce debate in the community. But at a local level, at like even the level of like a Brazilian state, it's essentially zero. Like it's essentially sequestering nothing. So it really depends on the type of system that you're looking at. If you're talking about, I hate to say it, but some of the most efficient systems at actually capturing CO2 are basically timber plantations. Like teak and eucalyptus plantations are enormously efficient at removing CO2 because they're enormously efficient at growing trees. Mangroves also are enormously efficient. So we have to basically balance our desire as a society to remove CO2 very quickly versus the co-benefits that you get from kind of a natural forest or a forest of this type or that type. This is one of the things that, I mean, I'm on the fence about. I don't necessarily have a philosophical problem with eucalyptus plantations as long as they are being planted only for carbon. And people often point to like direct air capture as being like a better way of removing CO2, right? As if like putting a gigantic like factory in the middle of the desert is in some way better than planting trees on that land instead, even if those trees happen to, not be native. So I think forestry often gets a lot of flack that it doesn't deserve because no other project type, methane landfill removal or direct air capture or any of these other project types, they'd never have to meet the same standards in terms of biodiversity and co-benefits as forest projects.
Sure.
If we're being fair, I mean, we should just be able to say, like, the best way to remove CO2 sometimes is just to plant trees in rows.
Yeah, I was even looking into bamboo. Like it seems to sequester a ton of carbon in such a quick time period. Like, and I guess it is more focused on, on the co-benefits, like you say, right? Of having, a preserved, Amazon or something like this, right? But I don't know. Do you think the market will turn more towards this kind of, I guess, not looking so much at the co-benefits, but hyper focused on, hey, like, let's get the carbon out of the atmosphere, whatever way is possible. Do you think, like, it seems to be that there's a ton of focus on the nature-based right now, which is, preserving forests with co-benefits?
Yeah, I mean, it seems as if it's been the opposite. It seems as if protocols have been like tightening up and like making you plant like native tree species, which I understand. I think from my perspective, the biggest problem with these plantations is that a lot of the time they're just timber plantations that the timber companies are planting anyway, right? By the time the project comes to an end, they just clear cut the trees and take the timber, or even during the project, they'll clear cut the trees and then replant them and take the timber. There's no restrictions in a carbon project, in a reforestation project, from them using it like they normally would for timber operations. And so that's the big problem there. But if you were just to plant these trees just purely for carbon removals, then I think they would be a fantastic way of removing CO2. The fastest rates of CO2 drawdown that I've seen from trees, they can get to like 30, 35 tons per hectare per year, which is an enormous amount of carbon.
Mm-hmm.
If you compare that to like the largest direct air capture facility in the world by, what is it, Climeworks, in Iceland, that removes about 4,000 tons per year. So you just have to plant like a mid-sized farm to outcompete the largest facility in the world. And they're working on a new facility that'll remove about 400,000 tons per year. But again, like this is like a mid-sized forest carbon project outdoes that easily. And so people will often say like, okay, direct air capture is the future. It's the thing that's going to scale, but it does not scale compared to forestry.
What sort of energy is that running off of? Is it I guess maybe if you said in Iceland, it must be some sort of heat from the ground, maybe?
Probably geothermal in Iceland.
Yeah.
I will say, they're not issuing credits, and they deduct their energy usage, if it is non-renewable from the credits. So I think we're safe on that regard. But still, it's just not efficient compared to planting mangroves or planting trees. Yeah.
Yeah. Are there credits in a voluntary registry? I'd be curious to take a look at those. I don't know.
For Climeworks, I'm not sure, but they certainly have that site, and they're certainly selling offsets of some sort. So
quite interesting. Cool. I don't know if you want to,
we could talk for hours.
I think we did last time we talked. We went for, I don't know, maybe an hour and a half or something, which was.
I see lots of changes to the carbon world. It's moving pretty fast. And I'm not happy about any of them.
There seems to be a lot of people looking at the carbon space now, which is, I think, a good thing. I think we have to see like how it plays out. Still, a lot of people I notice are kind of on that cusp of being interested, but not like really delving deep into it. So I think like as people start to figure out more and more, like products like the product you guys are building will have a huge product market fit, right? Because right now, like the average person, they're not even really looking into it much, I don't think, and kind of.
Well, more and more. I mean, they certainly like you get John Oliver coming out and like.
Yeah, that was big, right?
Yeah, that was fantastic. I loved that. Yeah, some of the biggest changes that I see in the market. There's this. There people are striving for quality, but they really don't know how to get to it, which is very frustrating. One of the biggest changes I see that's coming around is jurisdictional red plot projects. So have you heard of those?
No.
So increasingly, entire nations are now issuing their own credits, and this basically works by going through the UN and saying we're going to draw down our national carbon stocks. And then getting issued credits that can be bought by other nations or even bought by individuals. And this is quite the departure because like now we're no longer going through Vera. Now we're kind of doing this through international treaties. It's raised a couple of weird questions, like what happens if there's a existing Vera project inside of a nation that's now being issued with credits. The two biggest nations that I know have done it so far are Mozambique and Gabon. And I haven't dug into their numbers. I'm a little worried because there's not like a real tight protocol around what their numbers should be. It's kind of like based on international consensus, which is very scary. But more and more we're starting to see, attention being shifted away from like Vera Red Plus projects towards jurisdictional red projects in which like whole nations are being issued credits. Have you heard about what happened in the Congo recently?
No.
So the Congo, they kind of threatened the whole world that they were going to start drilling oil.
I did hear about this, yes.
Yeah. And my cynical take on that is that this is a clever play on behalf of the Congo to get more jurisdictional red credits. They more or less held a gun to the world's head and said that we're going to auction off this land for oil. And they said, okay, you can either give us carbon credit money or you can or we're going to, give the land away for oil. My fear is that they're now going to take this as a baseline scenario of what would have happened in the Congo and get credits for the entire country based on that. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very afraid that these jurisdictional red projects are not only kind of off to a bad start with like literally a country holding the world hostage about them, but also that there doesn't seem to be any protocols or rules around them, and it's this stuff is kind of being drafted by bureaucrats instead of forest scientists.
But so the UN then approves these credits? Is that the case?
Yeah, more or less. It's going through like the Article 6 of the Paris Climate Agreement. So it's kind of an international consensus, which is terrifying because it means that anyone, crazy statements can be made. So that's one big change to the carbon markets that is coming down the road. I think another big change is Vera is kind of changing the way that they calculate their baselines. They received a lot of criticism from people like me. And, one of their solutions was to stop calculating baselines inside of individual projects and then to like basically nest projects together and calculate baselines for whole areas, for whole regions. Mm-hmm. Again, I don't think that they've done it very well. And so I'm terrified that we're just going to end up with yet another protocol that ends up issuing way too many credits. But we'll see. That's a protocol that's in development that hasn't yet been approved.
Have you heard of other countries doing this besides the Congo?
There's dozens that are looking into it and kind of, inching their way. I mean, like Belize is looking into it. There are many, many countries that are now, I think, what is it, Indonesia or Papua New Guinea is looking into. So there's dozens that are kind of inching their way towards issuance. I think only those two, Mozambique and Gabon, that I know of right now have gotten credits. It's terrifying to me because I have zero faith in the ability of a government to, convince its citizens to think that they, is against their best interest, which is to cut down trees for heating their home. B, distribute the money properly. I wouldn't even trust my own government, like the United States government, to distribute the money properly. Never mind, all these other governments out there. I'm terrified. If you ask me, the solution to our problems in terms of quality is in the opposite direction. So, I mean, I find it deeply ironic that we've got this situation where like 50,000 hectare Red Plus projects are not doing very good because they're so big and nobody can actually manage to like keep deforestation out of them. And our solution has been, let's scale it up. I as far as I'm concerned, we need, the only way that carbon projects are really going to meet their objectives is if we scale them down. Mm-hmm. One of the biggest problems out there is that, for these large carbon projects, there's no stakeholdership, right? You go on the ground and like the community members in these Red Plus projects just don't even care. They don't know, they're not getting the money. They're not going to change their attitudes. If you scale it down so that a single landowner who owns 100 hectares or who is responsible for 100 hectares has to keep track of that forest, you better believe he's going to do a good job. I mean, if a farmer can sit on his front porch with a shotgun and keep people off of his land from harvesting a forest, that's going to be a much bigger incentive for him than just being part of a community that's enrolled in a massive project. And so I think that we're headed towards an unmitigated disaster in terms of jurisdictional red. But I do hope that, there's room out there for smaller projects. And I hope that really where this space can go is towards capturing individual tiny landowners or people who at the very least have stakeholdership over a small plot of land and then paying them on a very high frequency basis. And that's where I think a lot of the technology can shine too, because the bigger you get, the more you're kind of just taking averages on, just throwing darts at a dartboard. Mm-hmm. The smaller you get, the more you can kind of like really hone in and say, okay, they deforested the land and they didn't. I think that's another big problem with large projects is that many of the projects that are out there are just too big to fail. Like they're just too, like you work on a project for 10 years, you're a project developer, you're deeply passionate about this community, the money's being used to build a school or whatever, you're not going to admit that you have not stopped deforestation, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just not, you're never going to, even your verifier isn't going to admit it. On the other hand, if instead of having a 50,000 hectare project, we had 1,000 little projects inside that area, nobody would have a problem with pointing to Farmer Joe and saying, you cut your trees down.
Mm-hmm.
So I really think that, the only way we're going to solve this problem is by shrinking the size of these things. I don't see too many initiatives. There's a couple of initiatives out there that are doing that. NCX is trying to do that, but they've got real other big issues with their protocol. There's a new Vera Red protocol for, not Red, there's a new Vera IFM protocol for the United States that's trying to do that I think is one of the better protocols that's been put out there by Vera. Climate Action Reserve is trying hard to get small landowners on board. So I hope that these initiatives are not drowned out by, entire nation states with corrupt governments issuing unlimited credits.
The issue that strikes me there, though, is that these projects are pretty expensive to audit, right, and to onboard. So from a project developer standpoint, right, you're always going to go bigger than go smaller, I would think. So, like, how does that, I guess then that's where the technology comes in, right? We just make it super simple to audit and to onboard, and that's it. Maybe, I guess that's what you were saying, right?
This is where the technology comes in, yeah. So, what's very frustrating to me as a remote sensing scientist is that this technology is out there and it's been out there for decades. And you can even I can point you to a review paper. It's a meta-analysis of 100 different papers from 2013 that shows conclusively that LiDAR, which is like an airborne three-dimensional imaging technology, is capable of measuring forest carbon just as accurately as like a field measurement, right? None of this is accepted by the big four registry bodies. And I wonder why that is. They'll give you reasons that they don't necessarily trust the uncertainties or that they don't trust the models. My personal, again, very cynical take is that they don't have an incentive to really revolutionize their own industry, right? Like they've developed this whole ecosystem of feeder. They're like a dead whale carcass, right? Like all the little feeders come in to feed on them. They don't have an incentive to kick out the auditors and the verifiers by just using remote sensing models. That's my cynical take. Anyway, the technology exists out there to be measuring forest carbon using LiDAR at the very least. And that's been demonstrated thoroughly in the literature. And in fact, the timber industry, which is a much bigger industry, every single major timber company out there has an internal LiDAR program. So they've already adopted this. Like they have no real reason to. They do send people into the field, but they're doing a lot less field measurement than they were 20 years ago. Sure. The carbon industry has not accepted that. And so if we do start accepting this technology, particularly LiDAR, as a means of verifying the amount of carbon on a project area, then we can really scale down the price. One of the things that excites me is that, there's an enormous amount of LiDAR that's already out there. Every developed nation has basically already flown its forests. Maybe they're a few years out of date, but there's statistical ways of making up for that. So, I could conceive of just using public LiDAR out there and basically creating a protocol that requires no money at all to measure the forest, using existing data sets, using existing models, and then just having somebody who owns the land prove that they own the land and sign a contract and get credits as passive income instead of cutting down their trees. So this is the future that I'm looking forward to. NCX has kind of tried at that, and I think that they are having trouble getting buy-in, partially because they're not being very transparent about what they're doing, partially because they've got these silly little 1-year contracts. But I hope that that's where we're headed as a community.
Yeah, that seems like it would bring down costs a ton, right? And definitely be beneficial for the entire space. That's pretty much it. That's all that I had. I don't know if you have any additional comments. I think you kind of.
We could.
Yeah, we could go on forever, right? But no, I think that was good for a first episode, and was great to connect with you again. And thanks so much for coming on. And I guess being kind of the guinea pig here too, and testing this out. We'll see how it goes, but I'll let you know when I post it and stuff.
Let me know if you need more content, or if I'll throw on the same shirt, or if you like need help editing, or I hope I didn't make it too hard for you. But
no, perfect. If anything, I'm going to edit like some of my stuttering out and my pauses because I waited quite a while for some questions, but cool. No, it was great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. It was great to connect again. And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I'm excited to see like what you do in the space. I'm glad you're starting this podcast.
Yeah, I'm poking my head around quite a bit, so we can chat off air if you want to. But yeah, so it's going well.